lectures for the class TESOL Methods Language Arts. This is going to be working out of Chapter 1 this week. We're also going to be making sure, we're also going to be doing a little pre-work with regard to what makes a good language learner. Make sure that you have the correct book. We're using Nation's textbook. This is it right here. Teaching ESL, EFL, Writers, Reading and Writing. So let's jump right into the course here. These are the things that we're going to cover today. What makes a good language learner? How should language be taught? What are the key factors in language learning? Language learning components, and then building a curriculum process. Let's move on here. Language teaching. This is the beginning of Nation's textbook. It's an excellent beginning. I would love the way he summarizes language teaching into these 4 components. If I were to be writing a philosophy of language teaching, I would definitely include these 4 components. It's just a brilliant way that he summarizes all the things that should be done as far as teaching is concerned in a language classroom. He begins by talking about language-focused input. Meaning-focused input. This is input that the student receives. That means it's going to be things like listening and reading, and it should be focused on meaningful input that's meaningful to the learner. So there's not going to be a lot of information that's over their head or that's not interesting to them. If there's not going to be a lot of information here that is going to be beyond them, that they have to slow down and focus on language, but they're focusing on meaning-focused input. Likewise, a good language class should also have meaning-focused output, which means speaking and writing. Again, it's supposed to be things that are interesting to them so that it's motivating, but it's also not beyond their realm of capabilities. And so that's meaning-focused output. So you have a lot of communicative things going on here with listening and speaking, reading and writing, but you also have a language-focused part of a course when you're teaching. So language-focused learning means that you're going to focus on syntax, grammar, the lexicon. And so you're going to be focusing on the components as well. And finally, you should be having some focus or emphasis on fluency development. I find it interesting that in other areas, other philosophies of teaching language, they emphasize one or the other. They'll emphasize only meaning-focused input or only meaning-focused output or only language or only fluency. Nation's idea here, he combines all 4 of these together, and he basically gives a nice rounded components, nice rounded view of what teaching language should encompass. So it's very well done here. The only major thing that I don't see here is what to do with motivation. But other than that, it's very, very nicely all plunked together there. Excellent beginning of the book, and I would recommend that you memorize those 4 points. All right, what makes a good language learner? And I could ask you this. Think about your own language learning capabilities if you are bilingual or multilingual. What allowed you to learn language? Or if you know somebody who's a good language learner, they pick up language as well. What do they do? What do they know? How are they? And here are some answers that researchers have come to. Good language learner thinks about how they learn. They do metacognitive things. They think about, okay, how can I learn this? How can I remember? What's the process I do to go ahead and learn something? So they think about learning. They don't just try to learn the language, but they think about how to learn in that process. If you want to be a good language learner, you should be analyzing how you learn. How can I become a better learner? Good language learners are willing to experiment. They're willing to take risks. And so if you know people who aren't willing to take risks, aren't willing to make a mistake, aren't willing to jump out there and try something, they're going to have more difficult time learning a language. You need to be a risk taker. Good language learners are realistic. They're going to understand that there are times that they're not going to understand something. They're going to recognize that they can't do something at some point. They're going to try, but they're going to recognize, okay, You're going to be able to see what the value is of what they're doing. They're not going to be able to. They're not going to be dreaming. Oh, I'm going to be able to, learn 1,000 words in a week. Good language learners are independent. They don't need to have a teacher or a group in order to learn. They're willing to do it themselves. They're wanting to do it even by themselves. When I was on the train in Japan, I would often see students are sitting there studying word cards or reading English books, and I knew that they were studying. I knew nobody was forcing them to do this. They were just sitting there trying to work and master the language. They were independent. They didn't need outside stimulus necessarily. In other words, being forced by a teacher. Good language learners have a concern for communication and for accuracy. And sometimes these are considered opposites, where, I just want to get my point across even if I make mistakes. And then there are those who are like, I've got to be completely accurate, and at the cost of taking too long to communicate. Good language learner is going to have a desire to have both of these. I want to communicate. I want to keep the pace of the conversation going, but at the same time, I want to be accurate. And so there's a happy balance there. Good language learners use a number of strategies. They learn about these different strategies. You as a teacher, by the way, should be teaching them some of these strategies. But as they learn the strategies, they take advantage of them. For example, I know that when I was overseas in Japan and someone would use a word, and I didn't know what that word was, I would first of all stop and say, "Excuse me," in Japanese. And they would repeat the word, and then I would say, "I'm sorry, what does that mean?" I would ask for a definition, and I would try to understand that. If they couldn't explain it to me, then I would say, "Can you use that word in a sentence?" And so I would hear how they would use the word in a sentence to hopefully try to gain some meaning, gain some understanding of what the word meant. But I was trying to use different strategies in order to figure out what the word was. Good language learners are going to do that. They're going to try a variety of ways to try to pin down an idea, a thought, a structure that they don't understand. Good language learners are going to use top-down and bottom-up processing. They're going to look at the big picture and then try to find the little parts, and they're going to look at all the little parts to help them try to build the main idea. Good language learners, and here's a good seven different ideas that indicates that you have a good language learner. This list you're going to want to probably know at some point, have memorized. It'll be on a test. How should language be taught? If we go back to the earlier four components: meaning focused input, meaning focused output, form, and fluency, you're going to see that there are a lot of things that are going to overlap here. Again, how should languages be taught? Well, they should include form and structure. This is point number 3 in the earlier element here, this point here. Right? We should focus on form and structure. Language-focused learning, that's what that is. Okay? Focus primarily on meaning and not structure. Again, you remember going back up. Focus on meaning and not structure. Well, the two first elements here is meaning. Meaning focus, not so much on structure, not as much on structure. So you should include a focus on form, and again, that's back to language focused. Use as much of the target language input, so stay in the target language when at all possible. There are schools that require only the target language. You're not allowed to do anything in the native speaker's language, because that's considered a no-no. Immersion programs, some of them do that. And so people who use the direct method, they only want to use the target language. Follow a language acquisition syllabus. And a language acquisition syllabus is a syllabus that recognizes there are certain procedures or sequence of language learning that you should probably follow. I'm not going to go into any more details with that, but that syllabus should be in such a way that you see the progression of language from more frequently used elements to less frequently, from more simple elements to more complex elements type of thing. Good language teaching should require opportunities for real practice. Students who are learning language and they may be in a classroom where they're all together, they're all foreigners and trying to learn this language. But you should make them go out and practice with native speakers, if at all possible. If you can't find any all in face to face, try to find them on the web. Opportunities there. Take into account learner differences when you're teaching. Recognize that there are some students that are more motivated than others, that have more innate ability than others, that are more risk takers, that are more outgoing, and recognize that when you're teaching so that you can try to accommodate for all the students who are in the classroom. Okay. Here are some key factors in language learning. A good language learner is going to be a language learner that has motivation to learn. They want to learn. Think now when you're in college and you're studying French or German or whatever it is you're studying, do you really want to be there? For a lot of people, they're only there because they have to be there. And because they have less motivation to learn, their ability to learn and their actual progress in learning will become more difficult. Students who become independent language learners are going to do much better because they don't need to depend on somebody in order to learn language. They can find ways to learn without the need of a teacher. Right? Another factor is are students who can acquire strategies for learning language. In other words, they're going to go out and try to find ways to do this. They're going to try to figure out schemes and techniques in order to learn language. Remember the story of, I want to say Fredrickson, or Fredericks, I forget his name. He was a black slave, and he wanted to learn English, and you weren't allowed to. It was against the law to teach black slaves language. But he tricked the little white boys into having them teach him, and they didn't even realize. He figured out a strategy for learning because he wanted to learn language so well. He ended up becoming a great writer. Next point. Living with ambiguity is a key factor for language learning. Ambiguity, things that are vague and unclear, and you've got to be able to live with that. I'm going to live with this thing that's vague and unclear. There are some people who hate living with ambiguity. They're going to be very frustrated because of the situation that they're in, and they're going to have less motivation to learn because they want to know everything perfectly. And when you're learning language, there's a lot of times when you just can't do that. Now, again, the rational mind wants to do that, but age may also be a factor. Kids who are younger tend to have less frustration and have more time to study. People who are older tend to have more frustration because they have a rational mind and because they have less time to just enjoy the language, to study the language. Age will be a factor. Another factor would be your first language. If your first language is far from your second language, it's going to be harder for you to learn that second language. If you're an English speaker and you're learning Korean, it's going to be more difficult than if you're an English speaker learning Spanish, because Spanish and English are closer. If your first language is Spanish, but you can't read or write in Spanish, it's going to be harder for you to learn English than a student whose first language is Spanish, but they can read and write in Spanish. Okay, so if your language abilities are better in your first language, learning a second language should be easier. Next key factor, having a positive attitude. Believing that you can actually do what you want with this target language. And this means that you as a teacher want to imbue that positive attitude in your students. Convince them that they can do this. Convince them that they can achieve their goals. Make sure or try to ensure that they have a positive attitude toward learning this language. Maybe other factors involved that prevent that from happening, but support from home or friends or school or church, and the support you have there is going to help when you, again, are getting depressed or despondent or discouraged, right? Lastly, knowing your learning style, learning your strengths and your weaknesses. And of course, you want to use your strengths, but you also want to try to strengthen your weaknesses as a language learner. Whatever that style is, be you, someone who learns by listening, or someone who learns by watching, or someone who learns by, copying the activities of somebody else. And you ought to know what your style is, but then you also know what your weakness is. You can try to strengthen it. Well, those are some key factors in language learning. Okay. I want to talk about the language learning components. A nation does talk about the 4 components, which are reading, writing, listening, and speaking. But these 4 skills must always take information from the 2 databases, being vocabulary and grammar. So we have 4 skills, we have 2 databases. And the 2 databases feed those 4 skills so that it can do what it's intended to do. Reading, for example, if I don't know grammar and vocabulary, I'm not going to be able to read. And writing will be the same way. I'm not going to be able to utter words unless I have that vocabulary, unless I understand the rules. Now, there are different skills, reading, writing, speaking, but I still have to have access to that same database in order to collect and organize the ideas that I have to be able to utter them. These are the key components. So whenever someone asks what are the key components for language learning, this is it. These are the 6. Oftentimes when they talk about the skills, they only talk about the 4: reading, writing, listening, speaking. But vocabulary and grammar are the two databases that you really can't separate from any of those. All of them are needed. Language components and the 2 databases. Databases is my idea. I don't think I've ever seen that in print anywhere. But 4 skills, 2 databases. Now, you as language teachers, you're going to have to develop a curriculum possibly at some point, especially if you're overseas or you're working with a new program. And what you're going to need to do, obviously, is going to have to find out what your needs are, and you're going to have to find out what the requirements are, and then build this thing. Here's a small process as we go down. We need to identify all the stakeholders, all the people that are involved or have a vested interest in this curriculum being successful. So this includes the students, it includes the parents, it includes the school, it may include future businesses, it may include other types of agencies inside the community. You as a curriculum developer should identify, okay, who all has a vested interest in seeing this thing succeed. Find out who those people are and do a needs analysis. Go to them, talk to them. What do you want to get out of this? I remember doing a needs analysis when I was working at a college and we were trying to set up an ESL program. And so we had to go to talk to all the faculty. We had to ask them, what is it that you need these students to be able to do when they get into your class? Most of the time it was they needed to be able to write. They needed to be able to write an academic paper. Sometimes it was they needed to be able to debate, or they needed to be able to give a presentation. Well, I had to collect that information so that I could use that in developing the curriculum. So I want to do a needs analysis. Next thing that I want to do is I want to determine the language levels. How much time do I have for these kids? They come in, do I give them only 6 months? Do I give them 8 months? Do I give them 3 years? And within that time frame, how many levels are they going to need to proceed? How big do I want a level to be? There are some programs I've seen, there's 3 levels. Some that have 6, depending on the program that they have. Of course, you need the next element here, the language depth. How much language do you want them to know? So, for example, a typical student who wants to go to college needs to know, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 words. The typical ESL materials don't normally go beyond 3,000. So what do? You got to determine what those language desires are and then provide materials for it. Lastly, you want to develop a component list, an assessment. So, for example, at level 1 in this ESL program, what are the components these people are supposed to acquire? What are the skills? What are the communicative skills or the linguistic skills, the reading, the writing skills that they're supposed to master by the time they finish level 1? And then for level 2, what's the data? And with all of these, you need some form of assessment. So by level 1, they should be able to do basic greetings and directions, for example. Well, then you have to develop a test to verify. Maybe it is that they actually have to go out and speak to people, and you observe them actually doing this and getting information. It may be that you put them on a scavenger hunt where they have to get on the bus and go somewhere if they're living in another country. But you're trying to assess them. You can assess them with paper and pencil, although it would probably be better to give them an actual task. Developing a curriculum entails these basic 5 components. Now, obviously, we need to break this down into more detail, which hopefully we will do as we go along here, developing a curriculum. And that's all for this chapter. If you do have questions, please do ask. You'll want to read the next chapter online and make sure that you're posting your comments